when we work into max velocity progressions, we can not only make the movements more simple, slower, but we can also shorten the distance and emphasize some of those key points that we use. All right, so those same positions that we want to look for, we want tall posture, we want hip height, we want an impulse upward, and we want front side action from the foot, meaning in front of our body. We want all of our leg action, at least as much as we can possibly create, to be on the front side to maximize our sprinting capabilities. So one of those ways that we do it, similar to the way that we did on the mini hurdle, we go hands on our waist. If our students are here, I'll tell them go ahead and kick back and tell me what you felt on this middle finger or pointer finger. They should say nothing. If I say bring your foot up here, they ought to say I felt some sort of pinch. All right, I feel my fingers pinching between my thigh and my hip. So when we go just quickly through the 5-yard progressions, we'll go through hands on waist and we'll just run through it. Again, we're getting front side action. We're not creating a whole bunch of forward momentum, that it's simply creating the foot action maybe that we're looking for. It might be more of an up and down. It might even be a little bit more of a forward and back because we're trying to create momentum this way rather than what's kind of carrying us. When we do go to top speed, that's the more complex variation. So when we go into a sprinting, all right, I might have them start with a 10, 15-yard buildup, and they'll go hands on waist, and I want to see them be able to feel that pinch. Again, I want them to feel it. I don't want them necessarily to just hear it. I want them to know the position that their body is in space. I want them to know the position that their body is in when it's in contact with the ground. So oftentimes when we'll go through the hurdles, I'll ask, what did you feel when we went over? What did you feel when you were directly over the hurdle? What did you feel when your foot struck straight down to the ground? And then when we come over and apply some of those principles to the track, we're out on the field and we're truly sprinting at max velocity, I'll ask them some of those same questions. What did you feel when you were in flight? What did you feel when your foot contacted the ground? How did that feel as opposed to when we went over the mini hurdles? And hopefully, ideally, they say and relay some of the same ideas, some of those same words, some of those same cues that they might have used or might have kind of tried to apply themselves. Some of those arm positions you saw us use and apply when we were going over the hurdles are some of the same ideas, the same thoughts that we're going to put into our sprint mechanics. So not only will we be able to do those same movements in a shorter interval or shorter space, we'll also apply them when we apply those demands of a max velocity sprint. So I'll tell our guys and gals, I want you to sprint at full speed. I want you to then apply this arm position at a certain break in the sprint. So usually that's going to be when we start to get in our max velocity sprinting. That's probably for our young athletes, that's probably happening somewhere around 30 yards. And again, we can apply those in shorter distances so they can feel it. We can even go through some basic march progressions or basic short interval mechanics that they can use, and hopefully they can apply to their larger picture sprinting. Just like we did over the mini hurdles, the first position that we'll use is going to be our hand on the waist. And again, I use that constantly. I almost use it as a cue in a teaching practice almost every day certainly every day that we're working max velocity. And even it applies to a certain extent in our acceleration when we're training that separately. So one of the things that I always tell them to do is stand upright. Imagine there's a line right down your body from your head back to your heels. I want you to go ahead and do like you probably learned when you were playing Little League baseball or football. When people tell you to do a butt kick, you kick way back here, you keep your knee low, and you kick your foot backward. That's not what we want to feel. I usually ask them, actually, what do you feel in your hip flexor? They'll say probably nothing. When I come up to this position and I basically bring the foot straight up, like we'll want to see in max velocity, I'll tell them now, what do they feel on that middle finger or pointer finger or ring finger, whatever it may be. And they'll usually say that they feel a pinch or they feel their thigh rising it, something along those lines that, again, we want them to be able to feel it. I don't want to say thigh pop. I don't want to say foot forward. I don't want to say foot upward. I want them to know what it feels like so they can then apply it. So as we're maybe going through a marching progression, I might show them or have them just go through a basic march and feel it. We might speed up the process a little bit and go quicker feet. And then as I'll show in a second, we'll go straight up max velocity sprinting and we'll go into that specific technique. A big thing with the hand position when we're sprinting, I think honestly, speak to your client, speak to your athlete, speak to your student, whoever it is, find out where they best feel what you're looking for. So if you want to work on posture, if you want to work on pelvic position, if you want to work on foot position. Sometimes what one student might say to me is different from what another student might say, and one drill might not help that student as much as the other. So ultimately, although these hand positions are the ones that we use, that's not necessarily the one that I'm going to use for all of our students. That's not necessarily the one that maybe I would use for a 35-year-old master's athlete or over 40-year-old master's athlete, whatever the age may be, when they're looking at top speed sprinting mechanics. The next one that we do go through is teaching, again, stiffness, teaching potentially posture, stressing and emphasizing shoulder position. So one of the things that our students also tend to do when we correct pelvic position, although we don't correct, it's kind of just a false positive of what our technique is, we start to just push our hips forward, doesn't change much from our pelvic position, and what we do to counterbalance is kind of a drum major and send our shoulders back and send our feet way forward. We do want our foot action to be forward, but we don't want it to reach or paw or cast out. So when our shoulders go back, again, that's something that we don't necessarily want to see. So what I'll have them do, and again, we can demonstrate it just while we're basically marching or moving in place, is I'll go shoulders to each student, frankly, might be different. Some I might suggest rolling their shoulders over because they have excessive lean back, or some of them it might be the opposite and they have an excessive forward rotation and I want them to bring those shoulders back. Again, it depends who it is. Again, it depends on what I want to teach and what I want to stress. So we'll go in this position, same concept. We don't want to see that foot back here. We want to see that foot come forward. We want to see that foot come straight up and strike straight down when we go into max velocity and our impulse is downward into the track. So I'll emphasize, or I'll demonstrate what we'll do when we go hands out front, and you'll see some of those same characteristics, some of those same traits that we're trying to emphasize through our walking drills, through our in-place drills, through the hurdle drills in this sprint that you'll see. The next hand placement, arm placement variation that we'll do is hands going to be right at the side. Think airplane. One of the myths I think I see some of our athletes tend to think of, maybe some coaches start to cue, is thinking that we have to stay entirely flat. The fact of the matter is there's quite a bit of rotation in sprinting. There's quite a bit of I don't want to say excessive lateral movement. You might want to cut out some lateral movement and rotation, but there still is rotation in our sprinting. We do have asymmetries that aren't necessarily always the worst thing. All right, so some asymmetries maybe we want to correct a little bit. Some of them might just be a compromise or a compensation for something else. Otherwise, some of our sprinters just move differently and they create solutions to the problem of sprinting in different ways. So some of our athletes might show maybe a little bit like an airplane that's flying through clouds or flying through wind and has to have a little bit of lateral flexion. Some will come straight out and that's perfectly fine. The thing though that we're looking for again is posture. The thing again is that we're looking for is when I get in that position, correcting my posture, correcting my T-spine, my thoracic position, correcting my ribs, even my lumbar and pelvic position, is can I continue to have forward and front side action when I go to upright sprint mechanics? One of the things that we look for, or one of the things that I cue our athletes to do, imagine our elementary school students are right off to the side of your track and you're running and they're cheering you on and I tell you have to do this. I don't want you to smack them in the face, obviously. I don't want you to hit them in the head. I want you to rise above it. All right, I want you to rise above them. I want you to bring your hips higher. I want the impulse to be upward. All right, again, you might see someone tend to do this. It's not always the worst thing. You might see someone tend to do this. Again, if that's probably not what we want to coach our athletes out of or our students out of. So we want to, again, emphasize upright mechanics. We want to emphasize certainly foot position. We want to emphasize hip height, all right, and correct strike into the ground. But it's not necessarily to think about rotation. You'll probably see myself, I'll rotate or I'll flex a little bit to the side, and that's just compensations maybe that I've had in 15 years of athletics. So I'll demonstrate here, hands at the side, again in a max velocity sprint. The next hand and arm position, and all of these hand and arm positions might be used in an individual session. We're not going to run much more than 6 to 10 sprints probably over varying distances of probably 50 to 60 meters, depending on the day, depending on the time of year, depending on what the emphasis is. When we change these hand positions, this one in particular, I'm going to demonstrate hands up overhead. This is probably the king for us. If we can demonstrate this appropriately, we can show a vertical impulse of the hips, we can show front side action, we can show upright posture. I feel really good about what we can do when we add our arms into it. Again, you'll see some movements. All of these movements are changing the arm position. It's really interesting for me to see when we train our students, when we change this and correct leg action, how all of a sudden the arm action is kind of put into perspective and instantly corrected by correcting those leg mechanics. So when we go into upright and overhead posture and mechanics, sure, some of the things that we can work posturally in a stable environment in the weight room, under load even, some things that we can do in the weight room and out here, it might be a little bit different when we go and train in this dynamic fashion of a sprint. But ultimately, all of the standard is the same. We want to remain upright. We don't want to compromise any positions, especially that are coming from the pelvis, especially the action of the legs. So can we get upright? Can we bring the foot straight up? And can we strike the foot straight down as momentum of acceleration carries us across the track? This really is the ultimate probably for us. So if we're going to use multiple different hand positions or arm positions throughout the day, we might go back and forth from an overhead, maybe to hands on waist, or overhead to straight up arm sprinting, straight up running arm action. Or ultimately, it might be something that's progressive. So we're not gonna instantly on day one tell our student athletes that they're gonna sprint with their arms up overhead, because again, compensations come and compensations happen that are probably detrimental to what we're looking for. So as I demonstrate in this next video, we're gonna go hands up overhead, sprinting mechanics, show front side action, remain in upright posture and good pelvic position. We'll start to introduce some implements to our sprinting. Ultimately, what we want to see and what we want to look for when we're sprinting is, can we use this implement? Can we use this tangible external cue to help me learn the movement that I'm looking for? Again, it's a motor learning type of concept. It's a motor learning type of progression, and skill acquisition of max velocity sprinting is truly something that can happen, especially in these fruitful years of 14 through 18 that I see with our high school student athletes. And truthfully, I don't believe it's ever too late to correct some of these mechanics and work on some of those compensations. So when we add the implement, it takes maybe the tangible, the reference that I feel on my fingers, it takes some of the positions away, or it takes some of the concepts away from my arm position, and now it puts the emphasis on an implement that I have to strike. So when we go, the first movement that we're gonna do is a PVC at our waist. I like this one every bit, if not more, than I do the hands on the waist. It's the same concept. I tell our students, ultimately, I can even have you, I can watch kind of from head on. I'll obviously get out of their way once they get up on me. But I like to say, can you hide that PVC with your thigh? Maybe it's not necessarily going to happen, and I don't want them to, overcast or overstride. I don't want that. I just want a quick feeling of striking the PVC and getting the foot back down. But can you hide that PVC for me? All right, can you drive here rather than, if you're straight like this, backward, as I said we don't want to do, look what happens when I'm watching from the front. I never even cover, I never even cut any of that white. Where versus, if I get the foot going here where I want it, I'm probably going to block some of that PVC. All right, so I do also want to emphasize, we don't want to overstride, we don't want to overreach. So I don't want to see like an excessive closing, an excessive like knee to chest and casting out of the foot. I want us to strike quickly, and I want us to strike down. I want us to lift quickly with the thigh and our entire body, our entire system. And then I want to see that foot get right back to the ground, as I'll demonstrate here. Another implement we'll tend to use throughout our program, really, in max velocity sprinting, in obviously the stimulus that we can use it for, through some throws, through some various progressions that we could do with just about everything with the med ball. We also use it in our max velocity sprinting. It adds, of course, it adds a layer of resistance. The thing that I like about the med ball is it's not necessarily like a sled that's going to be behind us. The impulse that needs to happen, the strike that needs to happen against the ground does not need to be backward to create momentum forward. Instead, it's going to be, frankly, weighing me down a little bit. So my impulse needs to be down into the ground to project me upward. The position that I like to hold the med ball at, typically I tell our students, pretend you have a big belly and you're holding it. Maybe we can use Santa Claus as an example. A big belly out in front. All right, what I want to see you be able to do on every stride and really every stride throughout the sprint. Acceleration, you're going to have a different angle of punching into the ground. But when you get to max velocity, I want to be upright. I want to be able to strike with my thigh every single stride. If we tend to come back here, we're going to overly rotate. I'm going to put some, frankly, our body, our system is probably going to try to, it's going to do everything it can to survive. So it's funny how it corrects itself to remain upright so we don't fall over and fall onto our face, and we're able to strike here. If our students can't get here, there might be something to look at from a mobility standpoint, from a postural integrity standpoint, or it might be simply just the student not getting the concept of wanting to get their foot from here, again, to out front, and striking the med ball out in front of us. So I'll demonstrate. This would be a progression that we would use after the PVC, because it does add a little bit of resistance. It challenges us from a standpoint of we're adding load to the movement, but it is every bit the same concept. We want to feel a part of our body, our thigh, strike the med ball, as I'll demonstrate here. Similar to the hand and arm position, when we use a PVC dowel, any sort of implement that we add, you might use a different implement that just kind of clicks with your client, with your student, with your athlete. That'll work better for them. Just as I said, the hand positions might vary based on who the student is. Also, the implements might vary. When we do use implements, the opportunities, the positions really are endless. Obviously, you want to use it and create a position that is one that our students will take positives away from, that'll correct their sprint mechanics. Once you can find that, those opportunities are certainly endless. So one of the ways that we'll do it, we'll keep PVCs on shoulder, the PVC, the dowel on shoulder, just like we would when we're, maybe back squatting or whatever movement that we might do with the barbell. I tell them hold that position with the PVC. That usually helps them find a good postural position. I'll have them stand, and I'll stand at the side and tell them stand upright. And if there's anything to correct, honestly, in that stable, in place type position, I can show them, hey, your pelvis is sitting way back. Let's rotate it under you a little bit. Or, maybe there's something happening at the shoulder that I can tell them. So we will use PVC straight up at the shoulder, and we can use that through acceleration when we have quite a body lean or angle. And we'll also have that same, we could use that in max velocity when we get upright and we want our foot to strike right under us. The last progression that we'll use, again, as I've said, the hands overhead position is really the ultimate for us, because it tells us, number one, is that athlete strong enough, stable enough to be able to hold that position when their legs are moving in a fashion that is elaborate, fast, violent, and quite challenging for them. Can they maintain that upper body position basically from the hips up? Similarly, when we go to PVC, we can go straight acceleration with the shoulders, with the PVC at our shoulders. When we get right into that point, maybe where they're at near max velocity mechanics, over 20 meters, 30 meters maybe for our young student athletes, I'll tell them to go ahead and go PVC up overhead, which is where I can see really, do they start to have an excessive rounding of or arching of the lumbar spine? Do I start to see the ribs flare up? Or do I see a good, stable position of postural integrity that we can still maintain the same leg action? That's what we're looking for, and that's how I'll show it and demonstrate it in this next video. Ultimately, when we use those implements, when we use our hands in varying positions, I'll ask the students the same questions that I did when we went over the mini hurdles. What do you feel? Where's your foot striking? How did that feel? What position was your body in? What went right? What went wrong? Ultimately, every session, we end with a straight up sprint. So that straight up sprint isn't going to be a different varied arm position. We're not going to have our hands on our waist. We're not going to have our hands in a pelvic or in a prisoner or in an overhead position. We want them to finish with an all-out sprint with good mechanics, and we also want to put everything together with running arms. So they're going to go a straight up sprint as if they were on a field, as if they were on a court, and be able to apply all the concepts that we were trying to teach, and we wanted them to feel with those implements. So can they finish the session in a position of integrity? Can they finish the session in a movement of integrity that looks the way we want it to biomechanically, but also feels the way that the student athlete wants it to, and we can end the day on a high note?